This video was made possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you would like to join them in helping grow this channel, you can do so at the links in the description below. At the dawn of the 20th century, when the direction of the Russian social democratic movement stood at a decisive turning point, Vladimir Lenin's What is to be Done was written as an intervention to address three practical questions: the nature of political agitation, the organizational tasks of social democracy, and the plans for building a militant, all-Russia organization. By 1901, efforts to unify social democratic groups abroad had collapsed, and many social democrats took refuge in economism. These new developments convinced Lenin that the movement faced not merely tactical disagreements, but a fundamental crisis of direction. Opportunists had seized on the seemingly benign slogan of freedom of criticism to smuggle in revisionist tendencies and reduce Marxism to a philosophy of reform. For Lenin, this was no minor theoretical dispute. It threatened to degrade social democracy into a party of class collaboration, lured by reformism while abandoning the revolutionary road. Thus, the pamphlet What is to be Done, written hastily over the course of several years with frequent interruptions, became more of a sustained polemic rather than a positive outline. Lenin reveals how freedom of criticism was not an innocent call for open inquiry, but in reality a rallying cry for opportunism and ideological retreat. He then takes up the question of spontaneity, insisting that without the conscious intervention of social democrats, the workers' movement could never rise beyond trade unionism and would remain captive to bourgeois ideology. From there, his discussion of political agitation and organizational tasks expands into a broader argument that amateurism entailing spontaneity must give way to a disciplined cadre of professional revolutionaries, unified through an all-Russia political newspaper capable of fusing local struggles into a national movement. In the end, Lenin's polemic was not merely an academic quarrel, but the closure of an entire stage in Russian social democracy, a decisive effort to draw firm and definite lines of demarcation so that the revolutionary movement could march forward, united by theory, organization, and purpose. Lenin begins with a polemic against the fashionable slogan, freedom of criticism, which he argues was being misused to smuggle opportunism and revisionism into the socialist movement. On the surface, the phrase suggested an openness to debate and inquiry, but in practice, Lenin argues, it meant freedom for an opportunist trend in social democracy, freedom to convert social democracy into a democratic party of reform, freedom to introduce bourgeois ideas and bourgeois elements into socialism. Lenin situates this misuse and abuse of freedom of criticism in an international context, pointing out that by the turn of the century, social democratic tendencies had emerged across Russia and Europe, united not by a coherent positive program, but by their common hostility to what they labeled as dogmatism. But in reality, Lenin argues, they were converging in their rejection of socialism's scientific basis, the inevitability of capitalist contradictions, the centrality of class struggle, and the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Edward Bernstein's revisionism struck at the essence of this tendency, arguing that socialism should abandon the revolutionary aim and reconstitute itself as a party of piecemeal reform. For Lenin, this was not an advancement of Marxist theory, but a retreat into pre-established bourgeois criticisms of Marx. In practice, Bernstein's theory found clear political expression in France with Alexandre Millerand's entry into bourgeois cabinet. Millerand came to office as a representative of the proletariat, but immediately became absorbed by bourgeois politics. For example, he refused to resign from his post after state forces massacred striking workers, and he even joined in ceremonies for the Russian Tsar, whom French socialists had once correctly denounced as a tyrant. His commitment to bourgeois politics symbolized the consequences of turning social democracy into a partner in class collaboration, with his shameless opportunism representing nothing less than the utter humiliation and self-degradation of socialism in the face of the whole world, all for pompous projects for miserable reforms, so miserable in fact that much more has been obtained from bourgeois governments. This kind of adaptation to the existing order is, in Lenin's view, the political equivalent of abandoning the path of struggle. He argues that unity with opportunists can only be illusory, while genuine unity requires firm and definite lines of demarcation. In his famous metaphor, he describes revolutionaries as marching in a compact group along a precipitous and difficult path, when some begin calling for a turn into a marsh. Those who want to leave and head towards the marsh claim they are simply asking for the freedom to take a different route. Lenin says we should let them go. Only let go of our hands, for we too are free to go where we please, and free to fight against those who are turning towards the marsh. In Russia, Rabo-Chai Dilo, the media organ of the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad, took up the slogan freedom of criticism as a precondition for uniting the movement. But for Lenin, this was a mistake, and a signal that the paper had aligned itself with the international opportunist trend. The editor of Rabo-Chai Dilo claimed that the most pronounced Bernsteinians stand on the basis of class struggle of the proletariat, which Lenin described as a bold assertion devoid of evidence. Furthermore, the editor failed to identify any Russian opportunists by name, offered no analysis of their positions, and instead reproduced German formulas without considering Russian conditions, a tendency Lenin derided as slavish imitation. Lenin argues that the Russian context had its own peculiarities that prevented a simple mimicry of the German model. In the 1890s, for example, censorship forced revolutionary and moderate legal Marxists into a temporary alliance against neurodism. This partnership allowed Marxist ideas to spread widely, though often in diluted form. This is because many of the moderates were in reality bourgeois Democrats, and when they later embraced Bernstein, they vulgarized Marxism, downplayed class antagonisms, and sought to reduce the workers' movement to trade union struggles for incremental reform. This shift dovetailed with economism, which divided the movement between mental and manual labor, with the workers carrying out the economic struggle and the Marxist intelligentsia merging with the liberals in the political struggle. For Lenin, such a division meant surrendering the ideological independence of the working class movement. Under these conditions, he declared that the responsibility of revolutionary social democrats was therefore to revive serious theoretical work, wage an active struggle against legal criticism that undermines socialist consciousness, and reject any drift towards spontaneous reformist politics. Rabo-Chai Dilo, despite its talk of freedom of criticism, did none of this. In conclusion, Lenin turns the charge of dogmatism back on his critics, pointing out that their own program entirely ignored theoretical questions at a time of international debate over Marxism's future. For Lenin, Russia's revolutionary situation made theory even more indispensable. The party was still in formation, and it had to critically assimilate international experience rather than copy it, and in doing so, face the unprecedented task of overthrowing the most powerful bulwark not only of European, but Asiatic reaction. Lenin's bottom line, without revolutionary theory there can be no revolutionary movement, declared that without clear ideological boundaries, the Workers' Party will be led not along the hard road of revolutionary struggle, but into the marsh of reformism under the false banner of freedom of criticism, the cry of an empty barrel. Lenin's argument unfolds as a sustained polemic against what he calls bowing to spontaneity, which he identifies as the defining and most dangerous error of the economist current in Russian social democracy. He insisted that the strength of the present-day movement lies in the awakening of the masses, and its weakness lies in the lack of consciousness and initiative among the revolutionary leaders. For this reason, the question of the relation between consciousness and spontaneity is of such enormous general interest, and for this reason, the question must be dealt with in great detail. The absence of conscious leadership created an opening for the theoretical justification of economism by Rabo-Chai Dilo. In its polemics against Iskra and Zarya, Rabo-Chai Dilo claimed that the central difference between the two sides lay in their different appraisals of the relative importance of the spontaneous and consciously methodical element. It accused Iskra of belittling the significance of the spontaneous element of development by emphasizing the need for a greater role for organizational leadership. In other words, the fundamental ideological and strategic divide between the revolutionary social democrats, who recognized that the spontaneous element represented an embryonic form of consciousness still needing to develop, and the economists, who elevated spontaneity into a guiding principle in itself, was on the question of conscious organizational leadership. Lenin traces the origins of this ideological commitment to spontaneity to the great strike wave of the 1890s, particularly the mass strikes in St. Petersburg in 1896, which quickly spread across Russia. Compared to earlier, more primitive revolts, often involving the destruction of machinery, these strikes demonstrated a markedly higher level of worker organization. Demands were clearly formulated, timing was strategic, and workers consciously drew lessons from the experiences of other strikes in different cities. However, Lenin stresses that these advancements still fell far short of social democratic consciousness, because left to their own resources, workers could only achieve trade union consciousness, the conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation. The theory of socialism, by contrast, arose as a natural and inevitable outcome of the development of thought among the revolutionary socialist intelligentsia. Lenin therefore concludes that socialist theory did not and could not arise organically from the economic struggle alone. It was also the product of scientific analysis, philosophical reflection, and historical study, pointing out that Marx and Engels themselves emerged from the bourgeois intelligentsia. The task of revolutionary social democracy was to bring this theory from the outside into the workers' movement, integrating it with the lived struggles of the proletariat. By the mid-1890s, Russian Marxist theory had already been fully elaborated by the Emancipation of Labor group and had captured the imagination of much of the revolutionary youth. Therefore, when the mass strikes erupted, the theoretical resources to connect the economic struggle to the political struggle against the autocracy were already widely available. Organizations like the St. Petersburg League of the Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class consciously attempted to build this linkage, preparing political publications that explicitly called for uniting workers' strikes with a broad revolutionary movement against the autocracy. Yet the movement's immaturity, the inexperience of its leaders, and the instability of its underground networks ultimately led many of these efforts to end in failure. Lenin maintains that such failures were part misfortune. As a young organization, many failures and learning experiences are inevitable, but yet surmountable through persistent effort. However, for Lenin, the real full misfortune came when people were prepared to regard shortcomings as virtues, and even tried to invent a theoretical basis for their slavish cringing before spontaneity. The clearest example of this turn came with the first issue of Rabochoye Mysl in 1897, which claimed that the workers were taking their fate into their own hands by concentrating on economic struggles and minimizing politics. To Lenin, such a narrowing of focus to strictly economic issues subordinated the working class movement to bourgeois ideology, representing not a sign of independence, but a retreat. He says that, instead of sounding the call towards the consolidation of the revolutionary organization, the call was issued for a retreat to the purely trade union struggle. The spontaneous working class movement is trade unionism, and trade unionism means the ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie. He reinforces this point by drawing on Karl Kautsky, who declared that socialist consciousness was something introduced into the proletarian struggle from without, and not something that arose within it spontaneously. In other words, without the conscious intervention of revolutionary social democrats, Lenin argued that the workers' movement would inevitably fall under the sway of reformist or openly bourgeois currents. This is why he declared that it was the task of revolutionary socialists to combat spontaneity, to divert the working class movement, and to bring it under the wing of revolutionary social democracy. Rabochaidilo further critiqued the role of conscious leadership by claiming that the mass working class movement will determine the tasks of social democracy. Lenin maintained that this could mean one of two things: either that the movement itself defines the tasks to which revolutionaries must merely adapt, which is the economist view, or that the mass movement poses new, more complex challenges that demand a higher level of theoretical clarity, political strategy, and organizational strength, which was the Iskra view. Rabochaidilo consistently chose the first interpretation, which Lenin derisively labels as Tailism, passively following events rather than leading them. The practical result of such Tailism is to reduce politics to trade union politics, securing incremental reforms without challenging the structural subordination of labor to capital, and to leave the working class movement exposed to the influence of non-socialist political forces, whether liberal, clerical, or even police-sponsored. In contrast, Lenin maintains, true social democratic politics must be independently formulated, grounded in the historical mission of the proletariat, and actively brought into the economic struggle from outside. The mass upsurge of the Russian working class, he argues, was unprecedented in its scale and rapidity, yet this surge proceeded with such rapidity that the young Social Democrats proved unprepared to meet these gigantic tasks. The gap between the movement's potential and its leadership capacity can only be closed by rejecting the cult of spontaneity, strengthening theoretical foundations, raising the political consciousness of the masses, and building a disciplined, centralized organization capable of leading the struggle nationwide. For Lenin, the greater the spontaneous upsurge of the masses, the greater the demand for consciousness in the theoretical, political, and organizational work of social democracy. In short, spontaneity by itself will never produce a revolutionary movement capable of overthrowing autocracy and capitalism. The Revolutionary Party must not trail behind events, but must consciously shape them, acting as the guiding spirit of the movement, lifting it beyond the limitations of trade unionism to a unified, politically conscious struggle for socialism. Lenin takes Martinov's formulation that social democracy's task is to lend the economic struggle itself a political character, and shows it to be neither new nor revolutionary. It is instead, he argues, simply the age-old trade unionist conception of politics, dressed up in pompous words. This approach, he insists, serves as a screen to conceal what is in fact the traditional striving to degrade social democratic politics to the level of trade union politics. For Lenin, this means subordinating politics to the economic struggle instead of subordinating the struggle for reforms to the larger revolutionary struggle against autocracy and capitalism. He notes how economic exposures, such as leaflets that reveal factory abuses, play a significant role in agitating workers, stirring demands for better conditions, and sometimes forcing concessions from employers. But while such exposures are important, they remain limited. He says, these exposures merely dealt with the relations between the workers in a given trade and their employers, and all they achieved was that the sellers of labor power learned to sell their commodity on better terms, and to fight the purchasers over a purely commercial deal. This, Lenin argues, is still trade union work, not yet social democratic work. For Lenin, the task of social democracy was much broader, declaring that it leads the struggle of the working class, not only for better terms for the sale of labor power, but for the abolition of the social system that compels the propertyless to sell themselves to the rich. He says that it must represent the working class in its relation to all classes of modern society and the state as an organized political force. Thus, while economic agitation is useful, we must not allow the organization of economic exposures to become the predominant part of our activities. We must actively take up the political education of the working class and the development of its political consciousness. The question, Lenin asks, is what this political education must consist of. He rejects the idea that it can be confined to explaining to workers that they are politically oppressed. Agitation must be conducted with regard to every concrete example of this oppression, because oppression affects many different classes in many spheres: vocational, civic, personal, family, religious, scientific, and so on. Therefore, social democrats must organize political exposures of the autocracy in all its aspects, and without this, the development of workers' political consciousness will be impossible. This is where he directly counters Martinov and Rabochai-Dilo, who treat the economic struggle as the most widely applicable means of drawing the masses into active political struggle. Lenin replies that any manifestation of tyranny or outrage in any sphere can be equally or more effective for political agitation, but by restricting this agitation in advance to the most widely applicable means, social democrats adopt a trade unionist interpretation to politics. This is why Martinov's idea of lending the economic struggle a political character is, in Lenin's view, a rebranding of the struggle for economic reforms. Revolutionary social democracy always fights for reforms, but subordinates the struggle for reforms as the part to the whole, to the revolutionary struggle for freedom and for socialism. Martynov, however, resuscitates the theory of stages in a new form and strives to prescribe an exclusively economic path of development for the political struggle, dragging the party backwards and playing into the hands of both economists and liberal opportunism. Lenin singles out Martynov's formulation of the economic struggle of the workers against the employers and the government as a gem, the purest expression of economism, reducing politics to trade union politics. But, he argues, social democrats must convert trade union politics into social democratic political struggle, to utilize the sparks of political consciousness which the economic struggle generates for the purposes of raising the workers to the level of social democratic political consciousness. From here, Lenin expands the argument into the necessity of political exposures as the means of training in revolutionary activity. He says that workers must be trained to respond to all cases of tyranny, oppression, violence, and abuse, no matter what class is affected, to observe every other social class, and to apply in practice the materialist analysis and the materialist estimate of all aspects of life and activity of all classes. Such a clear picture cannot be gleaned from books, only from living examples and from exposures that follow close upon what is going on about us at any given moment. If workers do not react strongly to abuses outside their immediate economic sphere, Lenin says, the blame lies not with them, but with social democrats for failing to sufficiently organize. The backward worker, given such exposure, will feel that the students and religious sects, the peasants and the authors are being abused and outraged by those same dark forces that are oppressing and crushing him. This will fill him with an irresistible desire to react, from working around the censors, to demonstrating against the governors, to confronting reactionary clergy. This is why Lenin mocks Martynov's complaint that Iskra does not issue enough calls to action. He notes that Iskra was the only paper to openly call for workers to aid students drafted into the army in January 1901, a call that Martynov ignored despite all his rhetoric. Lenin also draws a parallel between economism and terrorism, saying that both are subservient to spontaneity, though they worship different poles. The spontaneity of the labor movement, pure and simple, versus the spontaneity of the intellectual indignation. Both evade the systemic political work needed to unite the revolutionary struggle with the working class movement. From here, he insists that social democracy must go among all classes of the population, not as a retreat from class politics, but as the only way to make the proletariat the vanguard of democratic revolution. The social democrat must be the tribune of the people who is able to react to every manifestation of tyranny and oppression, no matter where it appears, able to generalize all these manifestations and produce a single picture of police violence and capitalist exploitation. Limiting activity to the economic struggle, Lenin says, turns the social democrat into something far more in the nature of a trade union secretary than a socialist political leader. This is why he ridicules Rabochai-Dilo's boast of close organic contact with the proletarian struggle, code for tailing the spontaneous movement and leaving leadership in broad politics to liberals. Lenin insists that the spontaneous working class movement is by itself able to create only trade unionism, and working class trade union politics is precisely working class bourgeois politics. The instrument to unify and lead a truly all-Russian political movement is an all-Russia social democratic newspaper, a tribune for the nationwide exposure of the Tsarist government. He says that political exposures are as much a declaration of war against the government as economic exposures are a declaration of war against the factory owners. In our time, only a party that will organize really nationwide exposures can become the vanguard of the revolutionary forces. If social democracy fails to do this, more energetic non-social democratic revolutionaries will take the lead in political action, and workers will end up merely a force supporting those revolutionaries, the rearguard of bourgeois democracy, not the social democratic vanguard. By elevating such a limited conception of political struggle into theory, Rabochai-Dilo offers ideological cover to what Lenin calls primitiveness, a chronic amateurism that cripples the movement's effectiveness. For Lenin, primitiveness is more than a lack of training. It is a structural narrowness in revolutionary work, a failure to grasp the fact that a strong, centralized organization cannot be built on the limited basis of economism or trade unionism. He insists that this ailment is not the symptom of decline, but of growth, a disease of an expanding movement that can be cured only by a conscious, irreconcilable struggle against all tendencies to defend or legitimize backwardness. He says, the character of any organization is naturally and inevitably determined by the content of its activity. Consequently, Rabochai-Dilo, by the assertions analyzed above, sanctifies and legitimizes not only narrowness of political activity, but also of organizational work. To illustrate the problem, Lenin reconstructs the life of a typical social democratic study circle between 1894 and 1901. These groups were often initiated by students inspired by Marxism, not as a theory in the abstract, but as a call to action. They would establish contact with workers, begin propaganda and agitation, and without coordination with older activists or other groups, expand their activity by recruiting, publishing local leaflets, and even attempting demonstrations. However, the police, fully aware of these groups' activities, would often allow them to carry on to gather evidence, arresting leaders all at once and leaving no one behind to continue the work, eventually destroying these organizations. Lenin likens this to peasants armed with clubs attacking modern troops, brave but hopelessly untrained and unequipped. While such primitiveness was perhaps inevitable in the very first stages, it became increasingly destructive as the political struggle matured and the state adapted, using spies, provocateurs, and systematic repression to dismantle these fragile networks. Lenin underscores that the movement's growth was outpaced by the development of revolutionary organization. There were more strikes, more workers ready for action, but not enough trained revolutionaries to give coherence and continuity to that energy. The result was a movement that was sporadic, fragmented, and vulnerable to police disruption. For Lenin, primitiveness is tied directly to economism, because both minimize the need for a strong revolutionary organization, either by arguing that the masses have not yet raised broader political demands and therefore only immediate demands should be pursued, or by advocating direct action tactics like general strikes or excitative terror without the necessary preparation. In both cases, the underlying error is bowing to prevailing amateurism instead of struggling to overcome it. True political leadership means setting broad, long-term political goals and building the organizational capacity to fight for them, not trimming them down to fit what is accessible to the least trained sections of the movement. As he says, the worst sin we can commit is that we degrade our political and organizational tasks to the level of the immediate, palpable, concrete interests of the everyday economic struggle. Against this, Lenin insists on a professionalized, centralized organization of revolutionaries. He distinguishes this sharply from the organization of workers, which includes trade unions, educational circles, and other broad bodies. The workers' organization should be as broad and public as possible, uniting all who understand the need to fight employers and the government. But revolutionary organizations, by contrast, must be small, secret, and composed of people who make revolutionary activity their profession, without regard to whether members come from the working class or the intelligentsia. The danger of confusing these two, Lenin warns, is seen in the tendencies of some St. Petersburg economists which create elaborate, bureaucratic structures in every factory, combining trade union functions with revolutionary leadership. Such rigid organizational forms, while seemingly democratic, actually make mass arrests easier and tie the entire organization to local, easily monitored cells. This is why Lenin declares that the only serious organizational principle for the active members of our movement should be the strictest secrecy, the strictest selection of members, and the training of professional revolutionaries. He defends this model against the accusations of conspiratorial or anti-democratic tendencies, arguing that under Russian autocracy, Western-style democracy is impossible without endangering the organization. He says, it would be absurd to speak of democracy without publicity. Broad democracy in party organization, amidst the gloom of the autocracy and the domination of the gendarmerie, is nothing more than a useless and harmful toy. The real guarantee against arbitrary leadership, he argues, is not paper constitutions, but mutual confidence among revolutionaries, rigorous selection, and the political maturity of the organization. This is why the party must develop worker revolutionaries to the same professional standard as intellectuals. Talented worker agitators should be maintained by the party, freed from long hours in the factory, rotated to different regions, and trained in all aspects of revolutionary work. Only this can produce leaders with the combination of working class experience and professional skill needed to match the discipline and resources of the state. As Lenin declares, our task is not to champion the degradation of the revolutionary to the level of an amateur, but to raise the amateurs to the level of revolutionaries. In addressing the relationship between local and national work, particularly in the press, Lenin argues that the past years had seen an explosion of small, irregular newspapers, costly in human effort, unstable in principles, and politically narrow. He argues that these resources should be concentrated on a single, regular, all-Russia newspaper that could cover both national and local issues, coordinate the movement, and raise political consciousness across the country. Local newspapers should be supplementary, not dominant, and their overabundance should be seen as a sign of organizational poverty, not strength. Lenin argues that the economic struggle requires organizing workers by industry across local boundaries, especially as employers form national syndicates. This demands an all-Russia revolutionary apparatus to coordinate unions, produce trade union pamphlets, record experiences, and standardize demands. Without this, localism and fragmentation will lead to an overemphasis on narrow trade unionism at the expense of the broader social democratic struggle. As Lenin concludes, give us an organization of revolutionaries, and we will overturn Russia. Lenin defends Iskra's 1901 article, Where to Begin, against accusations that its proposal for an all-Russia political newspaper as the organizing center of the party was bookish and detached from the realities of local work. The critics claim that such a plan would subordinate or even obliterate existing committees and replace them with an autonomous editorial body that would legislate from above. Lenin argues that these charges are not only false, but fundamentally demagogic. No actual party committees took offense when the plan was first published because they understood it as a proposal to be evaluated and adopted only if it was found necessary and correct. For 5 months after the article appeared, there was no formal protest from any committee, despite the fact that many were corresponding with Iskra and other publications. In Lenin's view, the absence of complaints from those directly engaged in revolutionary work and the noise made only by third parties demonstrates that the criticism was politically motivated rather than rooted in the realities of party life. The committees that read Where to Begin understood it as an attempt to elaborate a definite plan for an organization so that its formation may be undertaken from all aspects, and they recognized that no such organization could be built unless its necessity and correctness were clear to all. Lenin insists that if comrades accepted the plan, it would be because they were convinced of its necessity for the common cause, not because they were subordinated to an editorial board. To attack the mere skeleton of a plan, not on the grounds that it was wrong, but because its authors had the audacity to propose it, was in Lenin's view pure demagogy. Lenin draws a sharp distinction between the substantive criticisms of Nadezhdin against the rhetorical assaults of Rabochaidilo. Nadezhdin rejected the charge that Iskra intended to create an inspectorship over the party, and at least attempted to answer the plan on its merits. His core objection was that neither a newspaper nor a mountain of leaflets could serve as the basis for a militant organization in revolutionary times, and that strong political organizations must instead be built locally first. He argued that people would relate more to concrete political work, such as building local newspapers, organizing demonstrations, or providing assistance to the unemployed. But Lenin counters that this is to miss the point entirely, as there is no other way to train a strong political organization than through the medium of an all-Russian newspaper, because it alone can unify the evaluation of political events, coordinate the diverse activities of the movement, and train leaders among both workers and intellectuals. To talk of rearing political organizations while counterposing paperwork to live political work in the localities was, according to Lenin, plainly ridiculous. For him, the central organ would be the main line by which the party could unswervingly develop, deepen, and expand the organization. He offers 2 analogies to make this clear. First, like a guideline used by bricklayers in constructing an enormous structure, the paper would ensure that all bricks, every act of agitation, every piece of work, were laid in line with the common plan. Second, like scaffolding erected around a building, the paper would mark the contours of the structure and facilitate communication between the builders, allowing for coordination and the distribution of work, and then be discarded when the structure was complete. Far from being a substitute for local activity, the newspaper would serve as the common framework within which local efforts could be integrated into a national strategy. Lenin stresses that without such a unifying line, local work will inevitably remain narrow, fragmented, and parochial. The result would be local committees not doing a tenth of what they could do while coordinating operations as pure fiction. This condition, Lenin argues, stems precisely from the narrow mental outlook and lack of training of functionaries confined to purely local organizations. The decentralization of the movement, especially through the proliferation of purely local presses, had in fact strengthened economism and amateurism rather than overcoming them. The All-Russia political newspaper is the only regular All-Russia enterprise that can systematically summarize experiences from every part of the country, identify weaknesses, highlight successes, and stimulate comrades to march forward untiringly along all the innumerable paths leading to revolution. Lenin further rejects the idea that Iskra's plan represents an expression of armchair politics. He notes that even the act of distributing a regularly issued political newspaper would help to establish real contacts between towns, encourage the exchange of experiences, and expand the scope of organizational work. Such a paper would provide mental food for workers of all trades and all stages of development, and it would turn isolated, spontaneous actions into consciously prepared interventions. It would also make it more difficult for the police to destroy the movement's organizational base, since they would not know where to dig for its roots. Regular common work would moreover train comrades in adjusting their tactics to circumstances, facilitate the transfer of capable agitators and organizers to where they are most needed, and gradually produce professional revolutionaries capable of leading the struggle on a national scale. If the majority of committees, groups, and study circles took up work for the common cause, Lenin believed that a weekly newspaper could be established for distribution in the tens of thousands, fanning every spark of the class struggle and of popular indignation into a general conflagration. Around this scaffolding, he argues, a regular army of tried fighters would emerge, who would head a mobilized army of the people in a decisive struggle against the autocracy. He insists that the tactics represented here are not a call for an immediate assault, but for laying effective siege to the enemy fortress, by gathering, organizing, and mobilizing a permanent army. Lenin therefore ridicules the logic of Nadezhdin's Eve of the Revolution theory, which simultaneously calls for more concrete local work and yet claims that it is already too late to build an all-Russia organization. But the more systematic the organization, Lenin replies, the more likely the regular troops will be able to lead the masses rather than be overwhelmed by them. Those who base themselves on nationwide political agitation are the least likely to miss the revolution because they are already weaving a network of contacts that both support spontaneous uprisings and helps the entire movement learn from them. The central reason for insisting on an organization built on an all-Russia political newspaper is that it alone can provide the flexibility that a militant organization needs, the ability to adapt to rapidly changing conditions, to avoid hopeless battles, and to strike when the enemy is weakest. Such an organization would be ready for all situations, from periods of reaction, when the main task would be to uphold the honor and continuity of the party, to the preparation and execution of a nationwide armed uprising. Without a regular common activity linking all organizations, arrests and police raids can paralyze work for months. But with such a center, new circles could be linked up and sent to work in weeks. In the event of an uprising, the network of agents formed in the course of the newspaper's production and distribution would not have to sit and wait for orders, but would already be engaged in precisely the kind of agitation and organizational work that ensures success, building contacts with broad strata of the population, learning to assess political conditions, and coordinating responses across the country. In conclusion, Lenin asserts that the plan for an all-Russia political newspaper is not the sterile product of dogmatism and bookishness, but the most practical plan for immediate and all-round preparation for the uprising, one that never for a moment loses sight of the pressing day-to-day work. In summary, Lenin's pamphlet divides the history of Russian social democracy into 3 distinct periods and calls for a decisive end to the third. The first period, between 1884 to 1894, represented the embryonic phase in which social democracy in Russia developed its theory and program but had no working-class movement. It existed as a small, isolated intellectual current with minimal practical activity. During the second period, from 1894 to 1898, social democracy emerged as a mass movement and a political party. The intelligentsia rallied against neurotism and worked closely with workers who were increasingly active in strikes. The movement grew rapidly, led largely by young activists who transitioned to Marxism while retaining a revolutionary zeal to overthrow the autocracy. The formation of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1898 was the high point of this period. Finally, the third period, beginning in 1898, marked by disunity, dissolution, and vacillation, saw the rise of leaders trained primarily in legal Marxist literature, inadequate for the needs of a mass working-class upsurge. Leaders lagged behind both theoretically and practically, justifying their backwardness with primitive and hollow arguments such as the freedom of criticism. Throughout this period, social democracy was degraded to trade union politics, with theory diluted into eclecticism and opportunism. Rabochai Dilo exemplified this period's spirit, characterized by theoretical vulgarization, petty practice, concessions to economism, and flirtations with terrorism. The idea of the party was reduced to bureaucratic formalism instead of a militant revolutionary organization. Therefore, Lenin concludes with a call to transcend these limitations, reach a higher stage of revolutionary organization, and put an end to the third period.